Stream 6.
Sorry, I'm joined on the Teams meeting.
You mute.
I am muted.
Sorry, just need to change.
Oh, it doesn't sound.
Okay. So welcome back to part 2 of Hearing Stream 6, day 2. And our next submitter we have is Forest and Bird. So we have Amelia yes, joining us in person, and Mr. Williams online.
That's right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, can you hear us okay?
I can, yeah.
Fantastic. Now, we did have your pre-circulated legal submission from the 13th of December, and I'm presuming that the hearing summary reports have been read by you both from our reporting officers. So perhaps if you are able to, in your submissions, sort of stick to anything that hasn't been resolved within the hearing summary statements.
You're talking about the statements that were circulated on Friday?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
How were these circulated? Were they posted online? I don't think I've seen those, sorry.
Yes. Okay, so they have been emailed, the links were emailed. So we have read the legal submission, all the panel have read it. So when you come to speak to that, maybe if you just pick out the salient points, there won't be any need to read the whole document. So I'd like to hand over to you both and welcome.
Thank you. I will start and will pick up after me. Thank you for hearing us. My presentation will be, as I'm really only speaking to one of our submission points, and Tim has got the bulk of our hand. So I would like to actually start with an anecdote. My great-grandmother was born on the last day of the 19th century at Kaipororo near Mount Bruce. So she grew up telling stories of the fires that used to burn out of control in her childhood as the city burnt down the bush in the name of farming, clear the land for farming. She was a passionate conservationist and was very distressed by the fires she used to see in her childhood, and that was quite a formative experience for her that has since perpetuated down through my family. So I wanted to bring your attention to the Waiata of Wairarapa. This is a map, slide 1 is a map actually produced by DOC. These are all the ecological districts of the Wairarapa region. I'd like to illuminate my presentation by just focusing on the Wairarapa Plains, because that's where most people live in the Wairarapa, and it's the ecological district that everyone's most familiar with. And that's highlighted by the grey area here on the picture. So to give a bit more detail about the plains more generally, this is a detailed map of that grey area, as indicated from the previous slide. The Wairarapa Plains were initially modified by Māori, and the Wairarapa forests were lost to widespread fires around the 17th century. And by the time the early Europeans arrived, the plains were a diverse mosaic of forest types. Tōtara forest dominated the drier areas. Kahikatea and Mātai forest, Raupo, Harakeke and sedge swamps were in the wetter areas. That's indicated by the yellow on the map. By the mid-19th century, the remaining forest was a large 9,000 acre block between the Waiohine and Waingawa rivers. That's indicated by the black on this map. Forest and Bird is a steward of one of the last remnants of that forest at our reserve at Fensham, just almost due west of here. Smaller forests remained along parts of the Waipoa and Ruamahanga rivers. the west shore of the Lake Wairarapa on Tirohanga Hill, and a band of in a band extending south and west from the main forest block through Morrison's Bush to the Tauhiriniko River. A large forest on the eastern Wairarapa Hill country extended onto the plains along the Tauwiru River. Podocarps and broadleaf species dominated the canopy. Elsewhere, forests were replaced by native grasslands covering around half the plains shown in green on this picture, as well as an extensive fernland, particularly bracken, swamps and scrub, and a complex mosaic of vegetation types. By the time my great-grandmother was born, the settlers were burning the sad remnants of a once complex and diverse landscape. But the overt burning and destruction happened a long time ago and shaped the thinking of people like my grandmother, who was a founding member of Forest and Bird, incidentally. However, the legacy of those land clearances is still felt today, and the Wairarapa is now quite literally a shadow of its former biodiverse glory. And in the face of such loss, every remnant is significant. The next map shows you that earlier picture of the diverse Wairarapa plains against more recent work that shows the land cover that is today. And then when I remove that, you can see what's left. The Wairarapa plains in particular have less than 10% Indigenous cover left across the entire area. This, I find, is quite a confronting picture. It was work undertaken by Manaaki Whenua, Land Care Research. Almost the entire plains have been deforested. The remaining bits in orange down near Pirinoa represent only 10 to 20% Indigenous cover. The Wairarapa, instead of being that biodiverse mosaic, is now a mosaic of loss. And in the face of such loss, every remnant is significant. So to be completely clear, district councils aren't the only ones required to protect biodiversity. This slide shows a map also compiled by Manaaki Whenua that shows the areas legally protected across the Wellington region, and this includes Kiwi2 covenants and public conservation land administered by the Department of Conservation. As you can see, the biggest pieces are the forest parks and a few good-sized blocks in the Eastern Hill Country. The next slide shows the district plan as proposed using the council's Wairarapa, the GIS viewer. You'll note that the majority of the green zones, so this map shows the zoning as well as the significant natural areas as proposed in the plan. You'll note that the majority of the green zones, the zones denoting open or natural open space, and the SNAs, an almost exact match prior slide, which shows which are areas that are already protected, meaning they're mostly the forest parks and public conservation land. Furthermore, the forest parks in particular represent some of the least threatened land environments nationally. So then I removed the zoning layer just to show where the SNAs were, and I overlaid once again that earlier mosaic Wairarapa plains just to show the representation of where it lies in relation to the mapped SNAs. And to paint a picture of where the protected areas lie in relation to what was once an incredibly important swamp forest across the region. And you'll see there's almost no overlap. When I remove that, just to take it back to the bare map of the SNAs, I tried to find out more because it paints a fairly stark picture. I looked up Schedule 5 in the district plan, or the proposed district plan, to see if I could find more about these SNAs that have been scheduled. But the schedule, as you can see, it just lists, it just denotes in the schedule just the code and then the name of the forest or swamp or whatever it is that it's denoting, which is not very much information. So I tried searching for them using the search function in the GIS, and as you can see, half of them aren't even mapped. I tried looking for a lot of them. There's no rhyme or reason which ones are mapped or which aren't. Mostly the ones that are mapped are existing public conservation land. There's not enough information in the schedule to find out where these places are and therefore protect them. So then, by comparison, I looked up an existing schedule and a second generation plan in the Wellington region. So here's one from Kapiti District Council. They call their SNAs ecological sites. The entire district has been surveyed, and based on just the first 3 in their list, it's clear what they are protecting, where the ecosites are, how big they are, the values that make them significant, and how that fits in the significance criteria of the RPS. Schedule 5 in the proposed plan for Wairarapa, by comparison, is completely meaningless. There's no way to locate the SNAs. Most of them aren't mapped.
Excuse me, sorry. I note up there that this is the SNAs have been rolled over from the ODP.
That's right.
Do you have a suggestion to make these more usable in a planning context for the plan?
Yes, well, the schedule in the planning, in the ecological chapter, it refers to the scheduled SNAs, but when you look at the scheduled SNAs, there's just nothing to go on. So we raised this as a point of, as an issue in our submission, and nothing came of it. And so we would suggest that following the example of Kapiti would be a really good way to start, would be a good place to start.
Okay.
Yeah, which is exactly what I'm getting to.
Sorry.
So that's exactly my point. The schedule, based on what's not in the schedule, in the operative plan, it's pretty clear that the operative plan probably has done nothing to protect these SNAs. And so therefore, by rolling over...
Could you give me some examples of where you say it's done nothing to protect?
Well, because,
give me an example of where something has degraded, because you're saying it's done nothing to protect. So
well,
tell me what it's done.
Well, because the schedule has no information. So if you're applying for a...
I want an example of when you make an allegation that the operative plan has done nothing to protect something. To make that statement, you must have an example.
Well,
evidence
or some evidence of it.
But it's almost the counterfactual. It's like there's no evidence to suggest that they have been protected, because based on this information in front of us, there's no way of identifying these places.
So there's also the converse of that. There's no evidence that they haven't been protected, I think, is what my colleague is highlighting.
Fair enough. And this is what we'd like to draw your attention to, is that there needs to be more work done to make sure that the schedule is fit for purpose, so that with this new proposed plan, it's going to protect the SNAs that are scheduled.
Okay, so what are you actually, and when you say fit for purpose, what are you actually asking for in a planning sense?
A better schedule.
What does that mean?
As listed by this one in the Kapiti plan. Even a grid reference is a starting point.
So what you want us to do is identify them?
Yes.
Okay, but from a planning perspective, there are policies and rules that go around this.
That's right.
Do you have any policies you want to?
I think sorry to interrupt. I think I'll probably be addressing this in a bit more detail. I think we say the SNAs have been identified, and so you just need to put in place the right policy framework. Yeah. Okay,
well, so that's what we're here to hear, is the policy changes and the rules that you are submitting on. And I accept your historical perspective on this, but we can't change what has happened. So what we're trying to do is say, what is it that you want to see in this going forward? Not looking back, but going forward.
Sure. And Sched 5, as far as we're concerned, doesn't help with the planning, with the policy settings. You can't protect what you don't know is there.
So you're looking for more explicit information regarding the SNAs in our Schedule 5?
Exactly.
Okay. So I think we've clarified that is what you're seeking.
Yes, and I hope I put that in my, I said, yeah, we seek that we give this further attention. And that's, well, yeah, I can just leave it there. I wanted to draw your attention to Schedule 5 and the fact that it needs quite a bit of work to get it into a state that means that the policy framework then is able to protect those scheduled.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your passion too.
And yeah, Tim will pick up on all the technical stuff as well. I'll pass it over to you, Tim.
Okay, thank you, Amelia. Thank you as well to the panel for the chance to speak and be heard on this. And apologies that I can't be there in person. I would have liked to have been, but wasn't possible. So I would just like to reiterate, begin by reiterating what Amelia said about the need to really fill out Schedule 5 so that we can understand where these SNAs are, what they consist of, and then be able to protect them in accordance with the relevant policy framework, which I'll come on to now. I'm not going to cover all the points that we raised in our submissions, and there's I'm not resiling from them, but there's really 5 key points that I want to address. The first is the way that adverse effects on SNAs that have already been identified in the Operative District Plan Schedule 5 need to be managed in accordance with the direction that's now provided in the MPS IB, including the relevant avoidance policies. The second point is around adverse effects on further SNAs that may be identified in accordance with the regional policy statement, including through resource consenting processes. And again, how the adverse effects on those SNAs need to be managed in accordance with the MPS IB. The third point is around the need for a policy to maintain Indigenous biodiversity outside of SNAs and manage significant adverse effects on Indigenous biodiversity outside SNAs, which is something that seems to be missing at the moment in the proposed district plan. The fourth point is around the coastal chapter actually, and giving effect to policy 11 of the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. And finally, just like to emphasize the point that, the plan should include the MPSIB definitions and principles relating to offsetting and compensation, which are an integral part of the effects management hierarchy. Okay, so taking just a step back from those points, if I could just begin by asking the panel to exercise some caution when it comes to applying the status quo approach that is referred to a lot in the Section 42A report on the Eco chapter. At paragraph 3 of the legal submissions, I've set out a list of the relevant policy statements, including the Wellington Regional Policy Statement, that are relevant to this plan change and that the plan change needs to give effect to. So, yeah, the status quo approach I've said is misleading to the extent that it might be thought to imply that the councils do not have an obligation to give effect to those higher order policies. And in particular, the MPS IB. So on that, I'm sure the panel will be aware that there's been some changes recently to the way that councils need to implement the MPS IB. And I expect you're aware of the Resource Management, Freshwater and Other Matters Amendment Act, which does have implications for this plan change, but in my submission, those implications are actually quite limited. So at paragraphs 8 and onwards, I've set out some detail from paragraph 8 to 14. I've set out in some detail the relevant provisions of the Amendment Act, and I won't go through those now in detail. I'll sort of take those as read, if I may. But to summarize, I think really the implications of the Act are quite limited. So what it really applies to is the identification of new sort of SNAs in district plans through a scheduling process. So what it does is it suspends that process of scheduling SNAs in district plans for a 3-year period. What it doesn't do is change how district plans should manage effects on SNAs that are already scheduled. So the schedule, in this case, the Schedule 5 SNAs in the operative district plan. And it also doesn't affect the approach to identifying and protecting new SNAs prior to scheduling under the regional policy statement. So those things are not, they're not altered by the Amendment Act. And although there have been some noises about sort of government intentions around resource management reform recently, it is important to bear in mind that this is a legal Schedule 1 process, and the panel, I'm sure you're aware, needs to apply the law as it stands, not take an approach based on speculation about what the law might be in future. And yeah, before sort of moving on to the policy details, I also just wanted to mention that I've been involved in a few different mediations in district plans over the last year. For example, the New Plymouth district plan, Central Hawke's Bay, and Porirua all are scheduling SNAs in their district plan and applying the MPSIB so far as practicable to those SNAs, including avoidance policies and exceptions to those as set out in the MPSIB. And then another example is the far north, where they haven't gone through the process yet of identifying and scheduling SNAs, and it looks like that is going to be a problem for that plan potentially. It does create quite a bit of tension in how you actually address significant natural areas when you don't have them scheduled in the plan. It creates problems in terms of having to have quite restrictive rules on general indigenous vegetation clearance and so on. But I think this is the first plan that I've come across where there are actually scheduled SNAs, and yet the council is really resisting giving effect to the MPSIB in relation to those SNAs. So I would urge you to look again at that. And I'm particularly talking about the avoidance policies that are set out in the MPSIB. So it's, not really good enough, I have to say, to, partially implement the MPSIB in relation to those scheduled SNAs by introducing the effects management hierarchy, and yet not include those key avoidance policies, which are clearly set out in the MPSIB. So that is a real issue for this plan, I'd suggest, and something that the panel does need to look at and address, find a way around this problem. And I think the simplest way would be, and the correct way would be to apply the MPSIB avoidance policies to those scheduled SNAs, with the exceptions for the national grid and renewable energy generation. That's an entirely practicable option for you, and it's what really needs to happen, I'd suggest, to give effect to the higher order policy.
I think, Mr. Williams, can I just pause you there for a moment? Ruth, do you mind removing that slide off the screen?
The microphone.
Oh, you share, yeah. If we can stop screens sharing, that would be great.
Sorry.
It's just a little distracting. That's better. Mr. Williams, I'm just conscious of time, and I know that the panel will have a lot of questions.
I can get through the remainder of the submissions pretty quickly now. Thank you. I think that
if you can just keep, we have read the submission, so if you could keep it just to the salient points, because we do want to allow time for questioning.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is a shame that you haven't read the summary statements. Also,
yes, it wasn't sent to me, so I didn't have a chance to do
Yeah.
that, but yeah.
But if you could just sort of hone in and that will allow us time to ask questions.
All right, so paragraph 16, I'm saying again, the avoidance policies should be in the plan. Paragraph 17, the SNAs in Schedule 5 do meet the NPSIB SNA definition, so they do need to be treated in accordance with the NPSIB. The Amendment Act doesn't change that. At paragraph 20, you've got the avoidance policies, clause 3.10.2 of the NPSIB. Those need to be in the plan. Okay, you can have the exceptions for, which I've mentioned, for specified infrastructure, but those avoidance policies need to be there as the baseline. Identification and protection of new SNAs, paragraph 24 onwards. For these, you need to look at the regional policy statement, which also tells you that you must identify and protect significant natural areas. So the fact that the Amendment Act says that you can't schedule those in the plan yet doesn't change the fact that you need to give effect to the regional policy statement. And the plan needs to give effect to the regional policy statement. Then you've got a question, well, how do you manage the effects on those SNAs pending scheduling? And there's appears to be a little bit of confusion in the proposed district plan at the moment. We support the idea that they should also be managed in accordance with the eco policies, but then I've suggested there may be a difficulty with the definition of SNA, which you need to look at, because it appears that that could limit those policies to only apply to the scheduled SNAs, i.e. the ones that are already in Schedule 5. Whereas actually those policies do also need to apply to SNAs that are identified through the district plan processes prior to scheduling. Maintaining Indigenous biodiversity, that's paragraph 34 onwards. At the moment, there seems to be a lack of a policy for maintaining Indigenous biodiversity. That needs to be in the plan. There needs to be a policy which tells the council and as a consent authority how to address effects on Indigenous biodiversity outside SNAs. And again, the NPSIB tells you how that should be done, which is that where there are significant adverse effects, the effects management hierarchy needs to be applied. And at the moment, that doesn't appear to be the effect of the policies in the plan. Okay, the effects management hierarchy only seems to apply within SNAs. So in my submission, that needs to change. If you're going to put in the effects management hierarchy, which we support, absolutely, it should be in the plan. It makes sense to actually also include the offsetting and compensation definitions as well. So otherwise, it's just a bit of a, why would you do one without the other? If you're going to give effect to the effects management hierarchy, you should also include the definitions of the terms which are integral to that hierarchy. So they should also be in the plan. And then moving on to the coastal environment, paragraphs 46 onwards, I've set out policy 11 of the coastal policy statement. As far as I can see at the moment, that's not in the plan. And it needs to be. The coastal policy statement provides specific direction for how effects on Indigenous flora and fauna in the coastal environment should be managed. And, the policies in the eco chapter don't do that. So these policies, the plan needs to give effect to policy 11 as well. And that's a key point. And then I've got a couple of points in relation to natural character, which are relatively minor. I won't spend time on those. And paragraphs 52 to 57, those are essentially the points that I made at the start. So the key points, which I'm just trying to emphasize here. So yeah, I'm happy to take any questions if I can assist you further.
Thank you. Alistair, would you like to?
I thought you were going to start. Okay, yeah, I'll start. So we're in a period of flux, as you're well aware. Government's given very clear directions on SNAs and has indicated that the NPSIB is going to be rewritten, and we're in the middle of a rewrite of the RMA. So currently, the plan is effectively saying we'll roll over the current provisions we've got in the operative plan. So can you give me any examples where that plan has failed to protect any biodiversity at this stage?
I can't give you prove a negative in that way. What I can tell you is that when you're changing the district plan to a Schedule 1 process, you need to give effect to the higher order policies, and you need to give effect to the relevant provisions in the Act. So what you can't do is say, oh, we think the law is going to change in the future, therefore we're not going to do anything. Once you're in this Schedule 1 process, it's very clear, you know, that you need to give effect to the higher order policies as they stand. So there's quite limited, I'd suggest really it's quite simple. The changes that have been made to the MPSIB through statute do not change the fact that the MPSIB needs to be given effect to as far as reasonably practicable in this process.
Well, isn't that the term though, reasonably practical?
Well, it is. It would be reasonably practicable to basically you've already got scheduled SNAs. So I can't see how it could be argued really that it wouldn't be reasonably practicable to apply the MPSIB policies to those SNAs. So there's no law telling you that you shouldn't do that. In fact, the law tells you that you should.
They have to be implemented by 2028 and 2031. Yeah.
No, that's new SNAs need to be scheduled. So the ones that are already in the operative district plan. Yeah. Need to be managed. Pardon, sorry.
If I heard your submission right, you're also asking for us to identify extra SNAs.
That's under the RPS. That's a separate obligation. That's not under the MPSIB.
Yeah, but you're asking for SNAs to be identified.
They should be identified. The RPS tells you, and the RPS has been enforced since 2013, tells you that yes, SNAs must be identified and protected. The Amendment Act, which recently came through, which is the only change to the MPSIB, in fact, only tells you that you can't schedule new SNAs for the 3-year period.
So we do have SNAs scheduled. We have our SNAs scheduled already currently. If when you have time, if you do access the hearing statements, and specifically looking at page 18 of the eco hearing statement, we have a table set out in front of us, and it explains the functionality of the ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity chapters. So it separates out the objectives, provisions, policies, the whole thing, provisions supporting protection of significant natural areas, and then provisions supporting maintenance, enhancement and restoration of Indigenous biodiversity across the Wairarapa. I recommend you do have a look at that, and so when you get to read, and have a chance to read through these at your leisure when you have time.
So these changes, oh, sorry, go on. Can I ask a question on that? I'm sorry. Are these changes that have been recommended to the council after the Section 42A report?
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
Yes. So these are the hearing statements that were online on Friday, which is the current practice for all of our hearing streams. I'm really conscious of time, that we have other submitters waiting, but I know that there are more questions for you. David, would you like to lead off, please?
Yes, good morning, Mr. Williams, Commissioner McMahon here. Just to carry on that last conversation, the process that the panel's been operating is that 42A reports go out, evidence is received, and prior to the hearing commencing, the officers have a chance to consider the evidence that's been received and decide whether that alters their recommendations at all, and that's contained in the summary statement.
Okay.
Timing is tight, but that's a function of the difference between receiving evidence from submitters and the hearing commencing. So the officers do their very best to try and give us the headline news, if you like, based on whether their views have changed upon receiving evidence, or sometimes they direct submitters to provide further evidence at the hearing to assist them in coming to a further consideration of matters. So that's
very helpful. Thank you.
that's the function of the summary statements. This was set out in the hearing procedures in minute 2 before the hearings commenced. And I think our hearing administrator, everything is posted on the webpage, but I think our hearing administrator also emails the links to those to the address for service of submitters.
Yeah.
So you may not have been the address for service in this case.
I think if it was sent on Friday afternoon, they would have received an out of office from Amelia. Yeah.
Okay. Look, I don't want to spend more time on that, but it's the process that we're using, and it's been pretty successful to date. In the time that's remaining, I just want to get a sense of a sense check of the inventory of Forest and Birds position. So I'm going to outline that very briefly and ask you to confirm or clarify where I've got it wrong. Is that okay?
Of course, yeah.
Yep. So in terms of SNAs that have been rolled over, the position of the Royal Forest and Bird Society is that the policy framework and rule framework is reasonably fit for purpose.
Sorry. No.
No.
The policy, no. The SNAs that have been rolled over, the district plan should give effect to the MPSIB avoidance policies.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if that's been recommended. I'm just getting to that now in the summary statement. I'm not sure if that's now recommended. Okay. If it is, then that's a positive step.
Okay, so that's a positional clarification I was trying to understand. So the avoidance policies would need to apply to the policy framework for SNAs that have been rolled over.
Yeah.
For Indigenous vegetation and biodiversity outside of scheduled SNAs, what you're saying is that the policy and rule framework needs some work. And that in particular, the effects hierarchy needs to be applied along with avoidance and along with definitions of offsetting and compensation.
Yeah, I suppose there's two parts to that. The first is that there may be, or there will be, I expect, SNAs outside of the scheduled SNAs.
Well, there'll be areas of Indigenous vegetation and biodiversity outside.
There'll be significant areas of Indigenous vegetation, yeah. Areas of significant Indigenous vegetation and significant habitat of Indigenous fauna outside the scheduled, currently scheduled SNAs.
Yes, and we're clear that the MPSIB does not require the scheduling of those, but you're saying that under policies 17 and 18, I think it is, of the RPS, that there's a requirement to identify and protect those.
That's correct, including through resource consenting, which I understand is in the policy, which we support. That's policy 3.
Yep. Would you agree that there are a number of ways in which they can be identified and protected?
Well, I mean, they need to be identified in accordance with the significance criteria set out in the RPS, and they need to be protected in my submission in accordance with the MPSIB.
Yes. Does that necessarily mean that they need to be scheduled?
They can't be scheduled yet.
Are there other planning methods other than scheduling that would help with the identification and protection of areas of Indigenous biodiversity outside of scheduled SNA?
The plan needs to say that they need to be identified. So essentially, you're going to be talking about large-scale projects normally, which fall under a discretionary activity status. So then the policies need to say that areas of significant Indigenous biodiversity, significant habitat of Indigenous fauna need to be identified, and then they need to be protected in accordance with the policies that are set out also in the plan, which should include the avoidance policies.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that clarification. I've got nothing further.
Okay.
Nothing. No. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Williams, for joining us. And Gary, thank you very much, and wishing you both very Merry Christmas, Happy New Year.
And you too. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thanks, Ruth. I would like to invite to the table Greater Wellington Regional Council. So you have Remy Bangy and
Pam.
Pam Guest, thank you. And Sam O'Brien online. Welcome. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, we can hear. Thanks.
Yep, fantastic. Feel free to put your video on if you would like, Sam.
Tēnā koutou, Commissioners. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at Greater Wellington. I have prepared evidence on behalf of Greater Wellington on the matters of ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity. My qualifications and experience are outlined in my evidence. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. And to the reporting officer on the response to date. This is my colleague Pam. She's also a senior policy advisor who would be assisting me with some supporting information that would support this statement today. Implementation of regional and national policy direction forms the basis of Greater Wellington's submission and further submission. The evidence I will discuss today focuses in particular on giving effect to or consistency with the NPSIB 2023, also the regional policy statement for Greater Wellington, both operative and proposed change one. I will take my evidence as read. I have summarised the areas where I support the recommendations made in the officer's right of reply and the areas that remain in contention in a table that we can pop up on screen for your reference. Yeah, while that is being popped on screen, I will continue with my statement today. My evidence on this hearing stream consists of 3 arguments that are quite key. One is why the proposed district plan must give effect to appropriate national policy statements, operative RPS, and have regard to the RPS change one now, as opposed to through a future change. Second key matter is why the scale and nature are essential parameters to manage effects of permitted maintenance activities within an SNA. And third key point is why adverse effects on Indigenous biodiversity outside SNAs is equally important to be managed. I won't talk to all of the points in my evidence today, but these are the only key points that I'll be focusing on. But just that table that we didn't have time to print out to circulate to you guys today, apologies for that, but we'll pop that on screen once that issue is resolved.
And if you can forward your speaking notes and that table to Ruth, and then that can be circulated.
Okay, that sounds.
And all that would be great.
Yeah.
After this.
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Diving into that first key matter that I raised about why the proposed
Sorry.
Apologies. Why the proposed district plan must continue to give effect to the appropriate national policy statements, operative RPS, and have regard to RPS change one. The reporting officer has outlined in their response in the Section 42A report that the Eco chapter largely continues the status quo approach to managing Indigenous biodiversity by adapting the provisions of the operative district plan into the new proposed district plan format. The timing of the new review of the proposed district plan is to properly give effect to the NPSIB is unclear in the officer's response in the Section 42A report, as well as the right of reply. The legal submissions filed on behalf of Greater Wellington for hearing stream 1 for the proposed district plan have addressed this question and have clarified that district and regional plans must continue to give effect to appropriate national policy statements and the operative RPS and have regard to RPS change 1 as required by the Resource Management Act. The NPSIB came into force on 4th August 2023, which has a full exposure draft that was released in June 2022, which provided clear direction and set out comprehensive requirements for local authorities to protect, maintain, and restore Indigenous biodiversity in the terrestrial environment. While there are a number of provisions in the NPSIB that require further technical assessment and engagement with communities and tangata whenua, in my opinion, there are a number of provisions that are still able to be given effect to in the proposed district plan as of now. The RPS Change 1 was amended to give effect to this direction in the NPSIB. The provisions incorporated in the RPS respond to the fact that, in general, NPSIB must be given effect to by the local authorities as soon as reasonably practicable. And Part 3 of the NPSIB sets out a non-exhaustive list of things that must be done to give effect to NPSIB. And the NPSIB provisions are highly directive, and many of these provisions provide limited or no discretion as to how they are to be implemented through regional and district plans. Because of these reasons, I consider that there is a high level of certainty and confidence that giving effect to NPSIB in the proposed district plan, as requested by Greater Wellington's original and further submission, is appropriate and will help to meet key statutory requirements for district plans in the RMA, including Section 6 C and E, Sections 7A, AA, D, and 31. Moving on to the second key point about why scale and nature are essential parameters to manage impacts of permitted maintenance activities within an SNA. This matter is particularly relevant to Eco P5. The reporting officer recommended amending the SHPO in Eco P5 from avoid or minimize to avoid where practicable. I do not consider this as a particular solution for the concerns I raised in. My concern was that because of the use of or, generally applicants choose minimizing over avoidance simply because it is a convenient option. The reference to where practicable, as proposed by the officer in their right of reply, again, is a subjective and often results in the same outcome, that is minimize being the preferred option, as it is easier and practicable than avoiding any adverse effects. A maintenance or minor upgrade activity, even after minimizing its adverse effects, can still lead to a major loss of significant Indigenous biodiversity, because minimize is a broad and subjective term again, and does not manage the scale and nature of effects of significant Indigenous biodiversity to the extent that should be. The policy applies within an SNA where the clearance of any Indigenous vegetation must not be permitted unless it is to an extent that is absolutely necessary. To ensure that the enabled clearance and the effects are kept to the minimum, it is essential to confine the maintenance activities to the existing scale and nature that maintains Indigenous biodiversities and values. Therefore, I disagree with the reporting officer that any activity could contravene with this policy if it confines the maintenance activity to a scale and nature that would maintain the Indigenous biodiversity. The NPSIB Clause 7 defines what maintenance means in this context. I could read out the definition if necessary, but I'll just rest my case in that. The reporting officer also responded to my evidence that Eco P5 and Eco R1 have references to, quote unquote, to the extent necessary, which limit the extent of clearance of Indigenous vegetation, which must be adequate in this context. In my opinion, this reference is not an adequate limitation to minimize the loss of significant Indigenous biodiversity, as the phrase to the extent necessary, which again is an incredibly subjective phrase, as a parameter to limit the extent of vegetation clearance that is proposed to be permitted within an SNA. Permitting clearance of vegetation for erection of fences within an SNA with no parameters limiting the extent and management of adverse effects is contrary to the direction in RPS 1, as well as the operative RPS, and also the NPSIB direction. For these reasons, I remain of the same views expressed in my evidence that avoid or minimize must be replaced with the activity is of a scale and nature that will maintain Indigenous biodiversity. Regarding enabling the erection of new fence lines and fire breaks within an SNA, landowners should seek to put fence lines and fire breaks outside the SNAs as opposed to within the SNA. Permitting these activities within an SNA does not comply with the higher order direction regionally and nationally. Cutting vegetation through the middle of the sites leads to further fragmentation, providing access ways for animal and plant pests. For these reasons, I remain of the same views that the reference to fence lines and fire breaks is deleted from this policy. I strongly believe that my proposed wording will eliminate any subjective nature of this policy and reduce the risk of unintended loss and significant biodiversity values, and provide clearer direction for permitted activities while successfully enabling the respective activities, including renewable electricity generation activities and national grid. Moving on to the third key matter, which is
Can I just, at that point,
Yep.
can I ask a question here? You've used subjective quite a lot. And I just want to question you on the purpose of the RMA. And the purpose of the RMA promotes sustainable management, right? And then it also defines sustainable management to meet reasonably foreseeable needs of future generations and to avoid remedying or mitigating adverse effects. All of those are subjective. Those very terms by their nature are subjective, are they not?
the RMA was drafted in 1991, and that purpose section is drafted.
It is the highest level of,
Yeah,
it is the act. So everything below it must give effect to that,
there have been several amendments to the national direction to refine that. So
not to the purpose. Purpose is not.
that is further defined and specified in the NPSIB, which is
That is a lower document.
I think the discussion, if I may jump in, the discussion here is around the direction and a policy and a permitted activity rule framework. And so the need for certainty in a permitted activity rule was really important in terms of limiting the adverse effects. You can't have a permitted activity if it's going to have minor adverse effects. So that's why you need to have certain terms so people know whether they're in or out.
But you're arguing from a perspective of black and white, whereas the RMA is not black and white. The RMA, by its very purpose and principles, is has wiggle room in it. And you can say, oh, it's been amended. Absolutely, it has many times, and it's made it completely unworkable, as we all know. But the principles and purpose has not changed. It is still talks about sustainable management, and it talks about avoiding, remedying, or mitigating.
So
And your proposals or your submission to me seems to be saying get rid of the mitigating completely.
I think there was a misunderstanding. That was not the intention of what I was saying. What I was saying is that Eco-P5 specifically applies within an SNAs, and it enables a lot of the clearance of Indigenous vegetation within an SNA. And when you're permitting an activity without requiring avoid, minimize, or mitigating any of the adverse effects within an SNA, that it doesn't align with what the RMA is saying or what the NPSIB is requiring, is what I was trying to make through the statement.
Okay, so I took it that you were very black and white on this, that it to avoid, in all cases it was avoid, and because you used avoid quite a lot and you used subjective.
No, I was referencing to where practicable. The reporting officer in their response have proposed that avoid where practicable or minimize. Where practicable is a subjective term. Often people just conclude that, where avoidance, where practicable, it's not practicable to avoid, so let's choose minimize. So that's what I was quoting as a subjective term, is where practicable, not avoid.
Funny enough, that's a subjective view of exactly what you've just said as well.
Okay, let's move on, because I'm conscious of time for everybody, and there will be more questions.
The third point that I wanted to make is why adverse effects on Indigenous biodiversity outside SNAs should be managed. In my opinion, the office's recommended version of Eco-P8 does not adequately manage the effects on Indigenous biodiversity outside SNAs. This policy as drafted does not give effect to the direction in the NPSIB, which requires application of effects management hierarchy to significant adverse effects on Indigenous biodiversity outside SNAs, and management of all other adverse effects to achieve no net loss. I also note that reference to avoid, remedy, mitigate in this policy does not reflect the correct sequential approach to managing the adverse effects as required by the NPSIB and the RPS Change 1 and the Greater Wellington Natural Resources Plan. For these reasons, I propose applying the effects management hierarchy for the management of significant adverse effects on Indigenous biodiversity outside SNAs and management of all other adverse effects to achieve no net loss to give effect to the NPSIB and consistent with RPS Change 1. I also propose that the adverse effects from minor upgrades for national grid or renewable electricity generation activities are managed using a less stringent management hierarchy, which is avoid, minimize, or remedy, which is consistent with the direction in NPSET Policy 3, NPS REG Policy C2, RPS Change 1 Policy IE2A. This less stringent management hierarchy for minor upgrades has been accepted by other district plans, if there is a need for an example. My colleague Pam can take you through a bit of a supportive information about why NPSIB could be implemented now as opposed to later. Previous slides.
Thank you.
Oh, in terms of the, we just quickly put a bit of information together. I sort of swing into the hearing yesterday and acknowledging that the reporting officer has stated that the operative plan is giving adequate protection to Indigenous biodiversity in the district. And so we went and had a look for the Section 32 report, looking for the evidence that those statements were made on, and couldn't really find any substantive evidence that was based on. So talking to colleagues, our terrestrial ecologists in the regional council, I guess the concern really is that most of the clearance, as you heard probably from Forest and Bird, is historical in terms of, or historic, in terms of the amount cleared. But the fact is that there's very little Indigenous vegetation left, particularly on the Wairarapa plains. So the concern is really the vulnerability of what's remaining, the fact that it's fragmented and quite vulnerable to incursions of pest and the effects of climate change. And so we just got a little bit of information from my colleagues. This is some information on their existing regional forest extent remaining. It shows the very tiny fragments across the Wairarapa plains, and then they've applied the national threat categorisation to this. So it shows endangered, Kapiti Coast coming across, less concern into the Tararuas, vulnerable on the foothills on the side of the Wairarapa. Critically endangered is the, these are the ecosystem types across the Wairarapa plains, where we've heard from Doc yesterday that 5%, there's only 5% of remaining forest that was there pre-European, so very tiny amounts, and then into the Wairarapa coastal hill country and endangered forest extent. And then there's, we did a State of the Environment report for the regional policy statement last year. It's not granular enough at this stage to talk to the Wairarapa, but this talks about the regional threat of our species, and it shows that we're not looking too good in terms of our threat classification. So I really just wanted to put this up in terms of the background context for biodiversity and its vulnerability, and that's why the importance of actually not leaving it exposed for another indeterminate amount of time. We haven't heard from the District Council as to what time frame they're looking at for a next plan change, and as you've heard from our legal submissions in their first hearing stream, this is kind of the basis of why we'd like to see the NPSIB given effect to now, apart from a legal requirement. That's just a quick overview.
Sorry, just to summarise the just to summarise our response to the right of reply recommendations. This is a has got a snapshot of our position as of now. We acknowledge the officer's support subject to the consultation with tangata whenua in relation to Eco 03, which we agree with. And for Eco P5, I acknowledge and support the changes to delete minor upgrading from clause B and insert a new clause that refers to maintenance and minor upgrading of national grid and electricity transmission activities. And we continue to seek replacement of avoid where practicable or minimise in the chapeau and deletion of E, which is the construction of new fence lines, as I just reported to you earlier. Landowners should seek to put fence lines and fire breaks outside SNAs, not within the SNAs. And that is because cutting down the vegetation through the middle of an SNA could lead to further fragmentation and provide access ways for animals and pest plants. For Eco P6, we continue to seek the amendments to give effect to the RPS Change 1 and NPSRB. Eco P7, we continue to seek the amendments to not provide for the removal of mature vegetation. There's less than 5% of pre-European vegetation on Wairarapa plains, and we support Mr. Leacock for the Director of General Conservation, who considers that if A is retained, it should be limited to the species that are older than 15 years old. For Eco P8, we continue to seek the amendments in the evidence to give effect to RPS Change 1 and NPSIB. Eco R1 are in light of the changes to the policies that we have. I've just briefed you before. We continue to seek our amendments to that as well. And Eco R2, we continue to seek our amendments there with the age limit set to Indigenous vegetation of Kanuka, Manuka and Tahinu that is less than 15 years of age. We acknowledge and support the amendments that were sought for both biodiversity offsetting and environmental compensation. And we acknowledge that the reporting officer has proposed to insert appendices to insert the principles for those two definitions. However, we would like to note that those appendices were not included in the right of reply version of changes. So we would like to follow up on that. We acknowledge the desire for the district plan to stand alone, but note the consequences that pest control for species are not included in Appendix 1 will require consent even though identification through these processes requires a comprehensive process. We continue to seek the amendments to the definition of SNAs as well.
Just clarifying, when you mention right of reply, you actually mean the summary statement?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, just wanted to clarify because they haven't come out yet. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for your submission. Questions?
Yes, I'm not going to ask you any detailed questions at all, but I'm very interested in the table that you've appended to your statement. That's very useful. I wondered whether you would mind updating the table in terms of reflecting any revised Section 42A recommendation, and also adding an additional column that indicates whether you're still pursuing the original relief sought in light of those changed recommendations, even though they might not be word for word.
Mm.
So that would be useful for the panel's deliberations, would certainly be useful for the right of reply.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a lot of work, but you can take a lead from the summary statement.
Yeah.
Modify your middle column and perhaps add an end column that indicates whether it's still an issue or not. That would be useful.
Just as a quick response to that, I think there were a handful of provisions that the reporting officer has accepted, which is objective.
And some definitions.
Yeah, and some definitions, but For majority of that, our views remain as the same as in the evidence.
I understand.
Like that, we will.
I understand that. It's completely up to you whether you want to do it.
Yeah. Thank you.
The only other question that I have is understanding what giving effect to the NPSIB now means. Just let me finish. Presumably, and I'm using my words carefully here, giving effect to the NPSIB now, as opposed to giving effect to the RPS. Presumably, it doesn't mean scheduling new SNAs. Is that's correct?
I will just cover the your first part of
Well, let me just
giving effect to the NPSIB.
if you could reference what it means in terms of scheduling.
Yeah.
And what it means in terms of policies and rules.
In terms of scheduling, it's a confused space, obviously. The RPS continues to require that sites are identified. That was amended. We did put a date in through change 1.
No, I'm talking about the NPSIB only at this stage.
Right. Okay.
I've drawn a distinction.
It suspends the timeline that it doesn't say not to, but it suspends the timeline.
Yes. So, and as soon as practicable, as soon as reasonably possible, or whatever the term was. So
That's
yeah. I mean, the council is not in a position to identify new SNAs between now and the release of decisions in mid next year. I don't think I'm not saying anything that people don't understand already. Council is committed to giving effect to the NPSIB from a scheduling perspective within the spirit of what the NPSIB says, and that's as soon as possible. We don't know what the time frame is yet, and that's a question that we're putting to Ms. Wheatley in terms of when can we expect a first scheduled response to that. So, but council was in a position, the panel was in a position to alter the policy and rule framework for existing scheduled sites. And we received evidence from the Director General, received legal submissions from Forest and Bird, received any evidence, and we've received legal submissions and evidence from Greater Wellington on that. So what is giving effect to the NPSIB, putting aside scheduling, really this?
yes.
Yes. The NPSIB has got direction more than just a schedule. Like it requires protection of the SNAs as well as a lot of things outside the SNAs. And our relief sought in my evidence is in line with that. And it also gives effect to the operative RPS as well as have regard to the RPS change 1.
We just park that for the moment. I understand that. The policy and rule and standard alterations that you're seeking will apply to both scheduled SNAs and for areas outside scheduled SNAs, and it's largely contained in this 12-page table. What is giving effect to the RPS and the extent to which we should have regard to
RPS change 1.
change 1, does that provide any additional obligations or any different obligations to giving effect to the NPSIB?
I think it's really aligned. It does continue to seek that new SNAs identified, but there's no expectation that you're going to do that within the timeframe of these hearings.
Yeah.
Although I guess the one opportunity that was raised by the Director General yesterday related to RAPs that were already in the plan. And
As an information layer.
Yeah.
that's right. And there seemed to be an opportunity to at least ensure that the permitted activity rules didn't apply within those areas.
Yeah.
And I heard you talk to the legal counsel about whether there was a natural justice issue with that, and the fact they're actually already in the plan and landowners had been aware of them provides an opportunity to have go a little bit further than the plan does at the moment.
Before we, the panel want to understand what the scope issue is first before we look at the substance behind that. But if there was scope, R2 and the policies behind R2 would be the presumably the area to look at in terms of the RAPs, presumably, without scheduling them at this stage. You'd agree with that? Yes. Okay. Right, so going back to my question, is there any different or new obligations in giving effect to the RPS or having regard to the proposed plan change that aren't already covered in giving effect to the NPSIB?
No, they're all aligned with the NPSIB. The RPS change one is aligned with the NPSIB.
Okay, so we can rely on this document largely then in terms of both of those requirements.
Yes, although Mr. Williams for Forest and Bird raised the fact that the NZCPS has not been given effect to, which I'm not sure that we picked up or not, but that is definitely an area that should be looked at.
Is that the issue of how it's given effect to him and in which chapter? In terms of, I mean, the planning officer has indicated that it is given effect to through what the national planning standards require. It's not in the eco chapter, it's in
Coastal environment.
etc.
I guess, so I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the plan as a whole, but it'd be important to look to see the NZCPS policy 11 in particular is given effect to, which is a direction around Indigenous biodiversity and the hierarchy of obligations there.
Yes, I'll make a note of that. Okay. That's useful, thank you.
Yep.
Can I refer you to your paragraph 35 on your policy Eco P8 that you were talking about? I'm interested in the second line of it. I note that reference to avoid, remedy, mitigate does not reflect correct sequential approach. And yet those are the exact sequential approach. And I can take you back to the purpose and principles. That's exactly the words in that order. So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah.
Okay, so the effects management hierarchy has been inserted into National Policy Statement for Freshwater and Indigenous Biodiversity, and it's internationally recognised best practice approach to managing biodiversity. So it's the Resource Management Act has a general principles and purpose at the front, which is a circumstance sort of avoid, mitigate, remedy, but that's not what the effects management hierarchy is about. So it's a very deliberate sequential approach to first you avoid, then you minimise your effect, then you try and remedy it, then you offset, and then you can compensate. So it's a deliberate sequential process. So it's actually not the same. It's giving effect to that higher order RMA direction, but it's a much more deliberate process, and it follows internationally recognised best practice by biodiversity offsetting practice. And that's the national policy statements have given more detailed effect to the RMA. So it's kind of that hierarchy. The RMA purpose and principles set the big picture, and then the national policy statements spell it out in more detail, and then the regional plans and district plans do their own evaluation to give effect to that. So it's a very hierarchical. So the effects management hierarchy is a very specific tool to manage biodiversity. So you're right, there is a general avoid, remedy, mitigate, but it's not in any particular order. Whereas the effects management hierarchy is very specific, and it's backed up by goals.
Well, I don't know. I suppose we've got to suggest that there is a deliberate order in an act. Words matter, and acts are very, very specific and have a very specific.
That sets the purpose and principle. So it's basically saying there's several approaches you can take to manage the environment, so avoid, remedy, or mitigate. Is it avoid, remedy, mitigate? But this process is being deliberately developed, and it steps through. If you're trying to protect biodiversity, first you try and avoid damage. If you can't avoid damage, you try and make it as small as possible. So it's kind of a logical sequence. So you try and do the least harm you can. If you still have to do some damage, then you try and fix it, like remedy on the spot. If you remedy on the spot, you've still got some what they call residual adverse effects. So you've got this sort of bucket of damage. So then you say, okay, so that first bit would minimise remedy and mitigation. At least it is, they've brought in this new approach where you can offset. So you can say, okay, I've done this much damage, I'm going to drain a wetland, I'm going to make a new wetland of the same size. Can't do that, then the preferable approach is compensation, which says going to lose a wetland, I'm going to give you a new forest. So it's a very deliberate process of having the least harm possible than like replacing. That's in the general realm of what we're talking about, but it's much more specific and yeah, a lot of guidance and case law around that.
Thank you.
Happy to send you some stuff if you're interested, particularly.
I'm just interested why you.
It is giving effect to that principle, but it's just doing it in a very specific way.
Well, I think that P8 is exactly what the officers have tried to do, is to give effect to the Act. Because at the end of the day, that's the highest authority, isn't it?
Indigenous fire outside SNAs.
Going back to around the coastal policy statement, the introduction for the coastal environment chapter states the coastal environment also includes significant natural areas, outstanding natural features and landscapes, and special amenity landscapes, which are addressed through the ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity and natural features and landscape chapters in accordance with policies 11 and 15 of the NZCPS.
I'm not sure I've seen policy 11 reflected in the eco chapter. I'm sorry, again, I haven't really gone back.
I think that also we need to bear in mind that the district plan interrelates and interconnects with the varying chapters. So it's not just one chapter, they all cross-pollinate effectively. So, but we'll go into that in our deliberations. If there are no...
Just one, sorry. Yesterday we had a bit of a discussion with the officers about policy, eco policy P4. Sure whether you had submitted on that or not.
We had submitted on that, but I haven't sought any further relief in my evidence.
Okay.
We were happy with how it was landed.
Sure.
O2A wording.
Which it was P4, wasn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
That was the combination of P4 and P6.
P4 and P6. The end result is that the officer has said that she would benefit from some further discussion with some of the submitters on the content of those two policies, particularly in terms of the carve-out that's anticipated under MPSREG and ET.
Yeah.
So that would be the energy companies, Genesis, Meridian and Transpower. The Director General is interested in being involved too. I just wondered whether...
Yeah, we're happy to be involved in that, yeah.
We'll set out a direction on that.
There was caucusing on that as part of the change one.
Yes, and policy 24D or whatever. Heard from Ms. Foster yesterday, and while she said it was a complete solution and it was subject to appeal, something that she felt might be useful in this instance.
Thank you.
Got one more. One very.
Sorry, can I ask a clarifying question for that?
Yes.
That's Eco P4 and another
P6.
P6. Awesome, thank you.
You made a comment. I just noted it down about fire breaks, and you don't like the idea of fire breaks going through areas of SNAs. Have you sort of tested that fire and emergency? Because fire breaks are obviously put in for a specific purpose and put in a site that fire and emergency say is probably the best practice. So just wondering whether if you put fire breaks around an area that contains a fire in that area, and you might actually end up with the exact opposite effect of what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, there are two things that I sought through my evidence. One is that maintenance of fire breaks, we didn't have any opposition for that. Existing fire breaks, and we were only seeking specific relief sought in terms of removing the reference to building new fire breaks and clearing vegetation for that. That is simply because there are no parameters in that policy or the relevant rule, apart from to the extent necessary.
So what sort of rule would you like to see in there? Because you also mentioned climate change, and obviously that's that increases the risk of fire or flood, depending which way of the climate change we go.
The specific rule that we have sought is amendments to our Eco R1, because at the moment, as drafted by the reporting officer, they're permitted, establishing new fire breaks and new fence lines are permitted. But we have sought that is amended. And then it becomes a controlled activity. That was our relief.
Okay, so you want a controlled activity for fire breaks. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all for your time today,
Thank you very much.
and wishing you all a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Thank you. Same to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Next we have Transparent Ainsley McLeod, who's joining us online. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, just afternoon, yes.
Just, isn't it?
I'm
Welcome.
also joined today by Rebecca Eng from Transpower, who's available to answer any Transpower related questions.
Fantastic. Just checking you've seen and revised the summary statements from our reporting officers.
Yes, I have.
Fantastic. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time today and also for accepting my late evidence and indulging my relatively busy early December. Firstly, perhaps it's worth noting that for each of the relevant chapters, my evidence records in some pretty long tables in some cases my agreement with the Section 42A report recommendations in respect of matters raised in Transpower's submission and further submission. You'll be able to see those tables in my evidence, and I don't intend to address any of the matters listed there today unless you have questions. I thought first I'd deal with public access. Transpower's submission seeks that policy PAP3 that sets out the circumstances where public access may be restricted to and along the coastal marine area be amended so that access may similarly be restricted to and along lakes, rivers and wetlands. Now, the Section 42A report recommends that Transpower's submission be rejected on the basis that Schedule 10 to the RMA provides for easements and esplanade strips to be closed. And my evidence, I set out the reasons why I don't think you can just rely on Schedule 10 to the RMA, and I don't agree with the recommendation and instead support extending the policy and the accompanying exemption to apply to rivers, lakes and wetlands. In reaching this conclusion, I particularly lean on policy 53 of the regional policy statement that does not distinguish the coastal marine area from lakes and rivers, but it's silent on wetlands, and instead provides a direction for the enhancement of public access for the coastal marine area, lakes and rivers, alongside exemptions to that. So in my evidence at paragraph 130, page 79, I set out an amendment to that policy to allow for the restriction of public access in certain circumstances. Turning now to natural features and landscapes, Transpower's submission is concerned that policy NFLP5 does not give effect to the NPSET. I share this view and conclude that amendments to policy NFLP3 and NFLP4, as recommended for amendment, are necessary to give effect to the NPSET and the RPS by enabling minor upgrading of infrastructure and providing national grid specific policy direction that embeds the seek to avoid language that's used in the NPSET. My evidence goes on to, as an alternative, support the inclusion of a bespoke effects of the national grid policy as an efficient and effective means of giving effect to the NPSET. And that's as opposed to perhaps scattered national grid specific provisions throughout the proposed district plan. And you may have seen that in my evidence, I've sort of suggested national grid specific clauses in a number of policies. So the bespoke approach would allow that all to sit in one place. I acknowledge that the summary statement agrees with my evidence that a bespoke effects of the national grid policy in the network utilities chapter will be clearer and more concise way to give effect to the NPSET. As I stated when giving evidence in hearing stream 5, I would welcome the opportunity to work with the relevant Section 42A report authors to draft such a policy based on my experience with similar provisions in other district plans. Turning to the natural character chapter, Transpow's submission sought the inclusion of the words to the extent practicable in policy NATC P5. My evidence concludes that section 6A of the RMA and objective NATC 01 do not require the absolute protection of natural character values, but only the protection from inappropriate activities. That said, I also accept the phrase to the extent practicable might not offer sufficient clarity. My evidence therefore supports an amendment to policy NATC P5 to provide further clarity while also giving effect to the higher order planning instruments. In this regard, I've borrowed from policy 3 of the NPSET and suggest the following wording, and that's to add to the extent practicable, having regard to the technical and operational requirements of the building and structure. That said, as with the natural features and landscapes chapter, I consider there may be an opportunity to address the effects of the national grid on natural character values in a bespoke effects of the national grid policy in the same way that I've just alluded to in relation to natural features and landscapes. Turning to ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity, Transpow's submission is again concerned with giving effect to the NPSET, but also seeks that where provisions are included to give effect to the NPSIB, these provisions exclude the national grid because the national grid is exempt from the NPSIB. And I just caught the tail end of your acknowledgement of that when you were having discussions with the earlier submitter. My evidence supports amendments to Objective Eco 01 and Policy Eco P6 to reflect the necessary, in inverted commas, special treatment of the national grid. The Section 42A summary statement supports the development of a standalone provisions for the national grid and renewable electricity generation so that the exemptions in the NPSIB are appropriately reflected in the proposed plan. I agree with that approach, and as I signalled earlier and in hearing 5, I'm willing and available to work with council officers and other parties to develop such provisions. In addition, my evidence considers Eco P5 and concludes that 2 amendments are necessary. The first is the deletion of direction in respect of effects management on the basis that such direction is not necessary because it cuts across and is subtly different to the effects management direction in Eco P6. In this regard, the summary statement now recommends that the words where practicable be included in that policy. I consider that this would achieve the outcome sought in Transpow's submission, and I generally support the proposed amendment, but I note that this approach is inconsistent with the recommendations in relation to NATC P5 that I've just spoken about, and where I've suggested further text to refine plan users' understanding of the term where practicable. And, you know, I earlier just mentioned the fact that I supported the wording to the extent practicable, having regard to the technical and operational requirements, that kind of language, so that it's somewhat confined. The second amendment to that policy I support is the deletion of safety and efficiency from Clause B of the policy. The summary statement now recommends the inclusion of a new clause that's specific to renewable electricity generation and electricity transmission activities, and I can confirm that I support that additional clause. Turning now to the coastal environment chapter, my evidence supports amendments to Objective CE01 so that the objective is consistent with the NZCPS. The Section 42A report agrees with my conclusion in respect I think that's actually the summary statement, agrees with my conclusion in respect of the direction given by the NZCPS, but does not agree with the amendments to the objective that I support because it is considered that it is not appropriate, that it's not inappropriate for the district plan to be more aspirational than Objective 1 of the NZCPS. I respond with some caution to this suggestion on the basis that to seek enhancement as an outcome beyond what is anticipated in the NZCPS does not strictly give effect to the NZCPS, and there's really no other higher order planning instrument to rely on for that, for seeking a greater level of enhancement than's directed by the NZCPS. In this regard, I continue to support the amendments I set out in my evidence that ties enhancement to natural or biological processes as it is in NZCPS Objective 1. I make the same point in respect of Objective CE05 and similarly seek that the objective is confines enhancement to natural or biological processes. Staying with Objective CE05, my evidence supports the inclusion of reference to inappropriate forms of subdivision use and development in order to give effect to the NZCPS. The summary statement generally agrees to this inclusion of these words, and I support the revised recommendation. I also support a similar recommended amendment in policy CEP2. My evidence goes on to seek to reconcile the directions given in the NZCPS and NPSET by supporting the inclusion of a national grid specific clause in policy CEP6. As with the other chapters being considered today, the summary statement confirms support for the development of a bespoke effects of national grid approach as a more clear and concise solution. The last matter I wish to address today relates to the inclusion of a rule to provide for the development of the national grid. The summary statement agrees that a rule should be included and sets this out at paragraph 37. The summary statement goes on to ask why the rule I support does not apply to additions and alterations. Because there are no lines currently in the coastal environment, a new line would first need to be built, possibly relying on this new rule. And the maintenance and upgrading of that line could not rely on the NESETA. To address this, I am of the view that the rules could be amended to also address maintenance and upgrading that does not comply with rules CER2.2 and CER3.2, so that these activities are also provided for as a discretionary activity where permitted activity thresholds are not met. That's all I've got to say after my relatively long evidence. I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you. David, do you have any?
Yes, good afternoon, Ms. Ainsley and Ms. Singh. I was rapidly taking notes as you were speaking. It'd be good if you could send through that summary statement that you were reading from, unless we've got it already.
No, I haven't sent it already. I found a few typos on my way through. I'll tidy them up and send it through.
Yes.
Thank you.
It seems that in relation to natural features and landscape and natural character, there's a process of conferencing that could assist in fine-tuning policies here that you referred to. And I guess the question from the panel was whether we would extend that to the public access suggestion you've had in terms of extending the policy and exemption to apply to rivers and lakes, and also some of the changes you've suggested under the coastal environment chapter. Do you think there's sufficient appetite to extend that conferencing beyond the natural features and landscape and natural character matters, and also I guess the eco exemption under policies 4 and 6? Those other matters?
Yes, I think that for all except for public access, I think that from the Transpower perspective and the need to give effect to the NPSET, there'd be a lot of benefit in considering particularly the merit of the bespoke direction and how to make that clear and concise rather than having national grid specific clauses throughout the plan. Public access, there's always benefit in having conversations, but I suspect that's a slightly different issue and may be able to be dealt with in a different way or separately.
What did you have in mind there?
I'm very happy to have a conversation with the council officer and any other representatives of parties that had an interest in that public access policy. I think it's very limited number of submitters from memory.
Yes, okay. And affects both both the policy and some exemptions. Also, I knew we were relying on policy 53 of the RPS.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Okay. Well, we might direct that in that case then. I didn't have anything else in relation to any of the other matters. Back to you, Chair.
No, I don't have anything further. You've covered off the conferencing, so we will issue a directive for later. We conclude the hearings today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time and wishing you all a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
It's getting closer.
It is indeed. We look forward to hearing from you in future hearing streams, no doubt.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next submitter we have is Chris Horn from PowerCo.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Oh, there's some very unusual echo going on.
Somebody is there. Oh, that's better. You can hear us okay?
Yes, I can, thank you. Do you just want me to crack into it, or?
Absolutely.
I've also got Gary Schofield here from PowerCo, just in case there's any questions, but it's one very simple point. I hopefully won't take much of your time, and I believe you discussed the same point earlier this morning with Mr. Anderson on behalf of the telcos, but it's just seeking a simple, pragmatic allowance for clearing Indigenous vegetation, small amounts outside SNAs for regionally significant infrastructure that doesn't have to delve back into what might have been done on wider properties over previous years, given that utilities often have a lease or traverse wider properties that aren't theirs, or they may be in the road network. So I put a suggestion up in my evidence. The reporting planner, Erica, very helpfully pointed out that there's already a provision in Rule Echo R1, which is what this all relates to, saying that if compliance is achieved, Echo R2, saying that if compliance is achieved with standard Echo S1, activities are a permitted activity. So my one concern with that is it has this link back to what's happened over previous years. So I'd suggested as an alternative, if you could have 20 square metres for place-based equipment or 20 square metres per 100 linear distance for a lines network as an alternative without having to delve back into those previous years, that might be a pragmatic way just for letting those sort of works proceed. And that's really the only point I wish to make.
Thank you. Does that answer?
Clear, thank you.
That's very clear. Wonderful.
So essentially what I requested in my evidence would probably just as easily be inserted into Echo S1 rather than amending the rule itself, and that would solve it from my perspective.
Mr. Horn, are those metrics, the 20 square metres and the 20 metres per 100 metre, are they sufficient?
So if I'm honest, it's completely picking a number out of the air. More would be better, but you know, you've got to start somewhere. So
Yes.
if the panel was of a mind to enable more, that would be great. I mean, the rule as it stands, or the standard SO1, says you can have 200 metres squared on a property, but that's within any 5-year period. So it's kind of, as I said, for utilities, it can be tricky to determine that, particularly in a road. So, you know, if the panel was a mind to allow 200 without having to delve back, that would be gratefully accepted. But sort of 20 was put in as an absolute minimum as a point for discussion. It's always arbitrary, the number, to some extent.
Sure.
Yeah.
Understood. Thank you for that.
Yes, thanks, Chris. Brian Dallas speaking. I'm just thinking, would we be better describing it as an average, 20 square meters per structure? Obviously, some might be 5, some might be 30. Is 20 going to cover most situations?
So from PowerCo's perspective, it would mainly be in terms of place-based equipment. It would be either some form of small transformer or a telemetry pole. So my sense is that would be enough. I'm happy for Mr. Schofield to put his hand up if he thinks it might need more than that. So that's for a place-based structure. The problem is if you do like a linear network over 20 kilometres, where you might take a little bit here and a little bit there over 20 kilometres, it might add up to more than 20. So that's the suggestion of making it sort of more of a linear ratio. So over each sort of 100 metres, you could take a bit and not have to add them all together.
That's as per page 6, your paragraph 18 of your submission of your evidence, isn't it? Just making sure I've got the right one open in front of me.
Let me find that. Correct. So when I made this suggestion, it was to insert it direct into the rule. I would modify this slightly now by just taking the actual standards and putting them in the SO rule for installation, upgrade and replacement of network utilities in the standard rather than changing the rule itself.
Yep. Thank you. That makes sense.
That's good.
Anything further? No further questions from any on the panel.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, and wishing you all a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Cheers. Same to you. Bye-bye.
Bye. And lucky last, Sean, welcome.
Thank you. First of all, introduce myself. I think many of you know me already. I'm Sean Draper from Martinborough, and own a farming property on the near Eastern Hills that overlook Martinborough. Keep my presentation fairly brief. Unfortunately, it's not full of so many acronyms that it sounds like a foreign language, but I do have one. That's the ONFL9, which was my submission about. And if you don't mind, I'll just read through that to begin with, and then I've got a few notes afterwards. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'd like the council to reduce the area of ONFL9 back to the specific visual known as the 3 canoes, or at least to include a smaller buffer zone within only the land titles that the 3 canoes are on. The mapping of ONFL9 has included a very large buffer zone that spills over the boundary onto my property. Visually and by perception only, the area known as the 3 canoes northernmost point is some 950 metres from my boundary. At the distance that includes the proposed buffer zone, and this distance stretches out to around 1,750 metres. I understand the canoes have a community and cultural significance, but believe that only they should be recognised as an ONFL for this case without such a large buffer zone. Such a large buffer zone and the effects of it, I believe, would be a breach of my property rights. I note, for example, the Tararuas are also proposed to be classed as an ONFL. However, in that particular case, the mapping has carefully been drawn to exclude the adjoining properties owned. To exclude the adjoining privately owned titles using the title lines as the boundary. Here, respectful consideration has been given to those adjoining landowners and their property rights. I've attached 3 supporting documents. 1, the proposed map for ONFL9 showing the 3 canoes circled in orange, and I hope you have those. 2, a map of ONFL8 as part of being part of Lake Wairarapa, showing the example of exact boundary mapping. And 3, a map of ONFL1 being the Taurua, showing the example of exact boundary mapping. All I ask is that similar logic be applied to this case of ONFL9. I've just summarised there a couple of small notes I've got. The area known as the 3 canoes has never legally been surveyed. So I believe to class any area that has not been surveyed and essentially identified solely by myth and emotion would be unjust. I believe the restrictions imposed could bring unintended consequences. For example, there is currently an internet station up there that is providing much needed service to a large geographical area of southeastern Wairarapa. With the restrictions that the ONFL would bring, such a structure could become impossible. The structure as it stands can hardly be seen by the naked eye. That's all I've got.
Thank you, Sean. Can we have a copy of your speaking notes? Are you able to email that
I'll
through?
email it through, yeah.
Yep, that'd be
Indeed.
great.
I've got Reese's email, so I just
Yeah, if you could, that would be great. And then we've got that on our files. Thank you for coming in and presenting to us and for your submission. Panel questions.
Can we get this up on the screen?
Yeah, thank you, Solitaire. Yeah.
Is that black line your boundary, is it?
Yes, that's right.
You're the
Northern.
part of
Small section, if you're up there, it's of the where the black line is what I've.
clear on this one.
Yeah, we're just going to pop it up on the screen. So.
Sean, what's your understanding of the rules that would apply if it was confirmed?
The rules as they currently stand, without them being altered in the future. I understand there's a without
the new rules in the
yeah.
proposed district. What do you think?
Without reciting them word for word, I understand there's limitations on what you can actually do in the forms of growth, erection of any sort of type of structure within a certain footprint and height. And then obviously more, but yeah, I can't recite them off the top of my head.
So Sean, can you orientate us here? We've got those 3 diagrams that you talked about, but
yeah, if you go back, can that be enlarged? To answer Craig's question to begin with, okay.
This isn't his diagram.
no.
That's
okay.
You can see the boundary line in the at the top.
So if you open the submitter 63's evidence.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's where the documents, photos are that we need to, yeah. Sorry.
Links are on the timetable. If it's easier.
Do you want me to email? I've got it. You got it? Yeah.
Yeah.
What's that showing us, Mr. Draper?
So the hand-drawn orange circles is the approximate area of where the 3 canoes, what's known as the 3 canoes, are.
Yes.
The green shaded area, the entire that's the entire area which is proposed to be the new ONFL9 buffer zone.
Yes.
The black line, which I've drawn, is my boundary with the neighbours.
Okay.
And all I ask is that that buffer zone be reduced back to down to inside that boundary line.
Right.
Has been done in other examples of like Wairarapa and.
So the area to the north of that line, essentially, you'd like to see excluded.
Yes, please.
That would meet your relief in total.
Pardon?
That would meet your concerns in total.
Yes. But just all I'm asking is to be in line with consistency of what the other ONFLs have done, for example, the Tower River Forest and the surrounding boundaries.
You gave us a couple of dimensions earlier, 950 and 1750 metres. Are you suggesting there's an 800 metre buffer in total from the northern extent of the first canoe?
Those measurements I've drawn through a program that I've got on just at home on my computer. I'd have to go through and just check those numbers.
But of that magnitude.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
So you're also of the belief that the green area is too generic?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Where's Windy Peak?
Basically where the line does the dog leg there, it's the lower corner of it is the highest point. That's where the trig station and the internet station currently sits.
On your black dog leg, the bottom part of the dog leg. There.
Yep.
Is it on your property or
the
trig station?
No, the trig station is actually on Pukeatua, which is on the right side of where the cursor is.
Right. Okay.
Any further questions for clarification?
I see that just that green, the buffer zone goes south of, in the bottom picture, how further south of it.
Right down the bottom. That's on the neighbouring property. I'm not too sure how far it goes. I don't think from the, I'm just trying to see if there's, can't really tell the lines there where the canoes are sitting. If you go back to the previous, please. It just slowed down there. No, it's not showing there.
Yeah. It does extend a little bit further.
Yeah, it's not
their
much further.
This might be for the reporting officers. Is there a reason why the buffer zone extends so far east compared with the actual three canoes?
That's actually west, so that's looking here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
North.
Left, right,
The other east.
Yeah, the other.
So that one I think is, lost it.
Mr. Draper, is there any visual connectivity from your property to the three canoes?
From my highest point.
From the points on the top side of the black line? I mean,
if I was standing anywhere along that black line looking towards them?
If you're standing on, yes.
Yeah, generally we can see them
visually.
Yeah, but not recognisably.
I mean, I don't know the area very well and I need to visit it, but I just can't get a feel for the topography and how far away it falls away.
The best visual perception is from the western direction.
That map shows it.
Yeah. Erica?
Ms. McRae from yesterday is available online to answer some questions if you have any that she might be able to answer around the extent
Fabulous.
Because the land rises towards your boundary, doesn't it?
That's right.
Yeah, so from the trig station, it's dropping down towards you.
Yeah.
Ms McRae, are you able to answer any of the questions in regard to?
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, you can hear me okay?
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. I just wanted to clarify, first of all, I mean, it's not a buffer zone. It is a whole ONL itself. So there was an original, as I discussed with you yesterday, there was an original extent of the ONL that was reviewed as part of the Wairarapa landscape evaluation, and that chose to add that additional landform of Windy Peak to the ONL. So it's not that there's an ONL and a buffer zone around the ONL. The whole feature is an ONL.
So could you just clarify that when you say the whole of the feature, is that going up to the high mark or including the part that then drops away on the northern side of it?
Yeah, the whole mapped area.
What's the relationship from the Draper's property back to the canoes? Because obviously it's dropping away beyond the, it's beyond the highest point.
Well, that's right. Yeah, that's right. But I think I explained yesterday, you know, there's the summit of Windy Peak is just outside the boundary, but then I guess in a landform perspective, the piece that falls away that makes up the rest of that landform, which I think we're showing now on the screen, you know, the Draper's property forms part of that piece of landform. So for it to be, you know, contiguous with fitting in that fourth canoe, in that whole piece of landform, to make it effectively, you know, those 4 canoe landforms as one ONL, it needs to be in there. I guess I understand where Mr. Draper's coming from, and I think the examples that he's given where ONLs have been snapped to property boundaries is slightly different. So he talked about the Tararoo Ranges where they've snapped to the property boundary. So that's at the base of the ONL rather than at the peak. So that's what my issue is there. I guess if you were looking, you know, we're not cutting through the Tararoos on a property boundary through, you know, the high peak that everybody looks at. You know, it's the bit at the bottom that's adjacent to private property. So if this was towards the lower part of it, then totally yes, I would probably support that. But because I think this is cutting through the middle of this highest peak, I just don't see.
Just a
Yeah,
question.
I just don't see the justification for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a little bit of confusion. Is the area known as 4 canoes or 3 canoes? You've referenced it as 4 canoes numerous times. So is it 3 canoes or 4 canoes?
Can I speak to that? It's only ever been known as 3 canoes. Now, all of a sudden, we're starting to try and include a higher point, come up with an idea. There's now 4 canoes. So I'm not sure where that is. If there is a 4th canoe, I don't know where it is or where they've got that from.
In addition, the ONFL itself was called Ngāwaka o Kupe Hills, to add to the confusion.
So the 3 canoes are the 3 prominent hills, 1, 2, 3, and then there's kind of a flattening out of one. Is that supposed to be the 4th canoe?
I think
On your far right of the screen.
the indication was that the 4th canoe is the one on the left.
Is the one on
the one on the left, yeah. So it's my understanding that there was historical research that was carried out, and also in discussion with local iwi that landform was also significant. So that's what's led to the, I guess, inclusion of that as part of this wider ONL landform. But I think my understanding is locally, anecdotally, the 3 are known as the 3 canoes. But yeah, technically there is this 4th canoe, or Windy Peak, as it's also called.
I'll respond to that. If there is a 4th canoe, I'd like it to be pointed out because there's several ridges and depressions to the left. That photograph there, to what you're looking at, is being given any justice, and it's just too much of a generic look at a landscape. The reference that Emma is referring to is from the book that Roberta McIntyre wrote some time ago, and I'm not too sure if it's a paragraph, might even be one sentence in there. So then to be able to propose to put legislation in place based around that paragraph, I think is absurd.
I don't think it's just purely based on that book, Mr. Draper. I think that's just one reference where it's been included. But my understanding is from consultation and research that was undertaken during the preparation of the landscape study, and this was, I'd just like to point out, like the inclusion of this area was agreed to by that, that Wairarapa landscape steering group that was in operation at the time of preparing the evaluation. So that included members from the combined council, iwi, federated farmers. So it wasn't the decision of one person. It was a joint decision.
Okay, thank you.
There's no evidence. If they've got more evidence than what Roberta McIntyre has written, you would think it would have been presented.
Okay, thank you, Sean.
Ms. McRae, could I ask a question in terms of the extension line that goes over the Draper's property? I look at that photograph, it looks like the ridge just is a gentle slope north, going down north. And then as we look at it, I presume it's probably about 700 metres to another big noticeable dip in that ridge line going north.
Other way.
Other way.
How did you determine that there doesn't seem to be any significant feature or any significant point on it where you've drawn your line? So how did you determine that was the point?
I think if I possibly can, I could share the mapping from the evaluation that looks at it in plan form, and that might make it easier to understand. Okay. So I'm just going to try and do that now. So this is the plan view of the evaluation. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
You can see that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great, because it's not showing me that you can see it, so just checking. Yeah, so the yellow is the operative version of the ONL, and then it's been extended at either end, I think, to capture two higher landforms. So it looks like there's a peak here at 268 metres, and it appears to be following a contour around there to capture that line. And then the same, like this is the Windy Peak, so this is, you can kind of see those canoe landforms there, the 1, 2, 3, and then this ridge here being the fourth, with Windy Peak being kind of the summit of it. And yeah, it's kind of following around a contour to capture the top of that landform. That makes sense. So I guess there's how you see it, in plan to capture it on a map, and how it actually appears visually when you look at it.
Ms. McRae, can we, I think we probably asked for this yesterday, but can we receive a copy of this image as well, please, for the panel?
Yes, no problem. Yeah.
Do you have...
I've got a question for Ms. Wheatley. Just remind us of the activities that are permitted and those that are not permitted in the confines of the ONL.
Sure. So within an ONL, that comes under Rule R1. It manages earthworks, modification of indigenous vegetation or buildings or structures. That relates directly down to standards 1, 2, and 3 of that chapter, particularly for buildings and structures. It permits a building or structure with a gross floor area of 50 squares and a maximum height of 5 metres, except telecoms poles of 8 metres.
Yes, that's building and structures. What about earthworks?
Earthworks is 50 squares as well.
And what type of earthworks are they? I mean, that...
Yeah, just says maximum 50 squares, maximum cut or fill of 1.5 metres, and there's an exemption for existing farm tracks, fence lines, water supply infrastructure, access ways.
Okay. Mr. Draper, the reason I asked that question is I just wondered, within that permitted rule framework, what what activities that you would undertake which would go beyond what's permitted?
Yeah, I'd be hesitant to suggest that we the current rules as they are permitted that we would never go and do something like that because you don't know what's around the corner tomorrow.
But what I mean, you're farming the property, right?
Yes.
Yep. Sheep and beef.
Yes, right.
Yeah. It's quite steep going up to Windy Peak. Have you got cattle?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. What's the likely 50 square metre building is a reasonably sized building, isn't it? It's a four bay garage. So, 5 metres high. It's single story, but still with a bit of roof cavity. It's what's the real likelihood of you wanting to build anything larger than that?
Back in 2013, and I'm not too sure if Emma was involved with it, we had Meridian Energy put a proposal in to build a wind farm up there.
Yes.
That has now been parked. Well, I don't think they will ever visit it, but there is an example of something that may have been possible,
yes,
without those restrictions.
Meridian have responded to these and sought some relief, as has the electricity generator, National Grid Operator Transpower. So putting aside utility type stuff in terms of day-to-day farming operations, what is the likelihood of you wanting to build a building greater than 50 square metres?
That's, as I go back before, that's something that I can't really suggest now. There might be a tourism opportunity there.
Yes.
I don't know, but you go back 20 years ago, and if someone says, "Oh, we're going to build wind turbines around the countryside," I wouldn't have been able to endorse that.
Yeah. So
that's what I'm saying is I don't want to be saying yes or no right now because you don't know what's around the corner. It's true.
Understood. And in terms of the earthworks type rules, what's the necessity for undertaking large scale earthworks? And
again, I can't envisage any large scale earthworks occurring there unless I found gold or oil, something like that.
And there.
Yeah, let us know.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Any further questions, Sean? Thank you for coming in and presenting.
Thank you.
We will consider.
Come and have a visit if the panel's mind.
Hey, we do a tourism thing just with friends and family. It's about a 2-hour trip and you get up there and it's just amazing. Yeah, so you're more than welcome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Might give us some sort of idea
Good,
about what
yeah.
we're talking about rather than looking on a map.
Yeah, that context as to.
Yeah, because it's all very well looking at maps and things, but without physically.
The real context.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I suggest in that case then a great point to look at it is at the Bidwell's cutting. As you drive into Martinborough with the car park is there.
Yes, I was going to suggest that as well. That's where that photograph is taken from that we were looking at before.
And as far as the backdrop to Martinborough goes, you can clearly see from that elevated point the clear outline of the 3 canoes.
Thanks, Sean.
Not the 4th.
Thank you very much for submitting and making the time to come in today. Have a great Christmas and New Year.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Oh, thank you. That now concludes all of our submissions for hearing stream 6.
5-minute break.
We'll have a 5-minute break and then we'll come back and wrap up the hearing stream. A 5-minute break, so reconvene at 1 p.m.